What follows are excerpts from the book Islamic Revival in British India, Deoband, 1860 to 1900 by Barbara Daly Metcalfe. But who is Barbara Daly Metcalfe, and why is her book on this subject so important for us to understand the revival of Islam in India, and what were the factors that led to the revival after having lost economic and political power? In focusing her doctoral dissertation on the history of the Muslim religious scholars of Deoband, a reformist religious seminary in northern India, founded in the 1860s, a study subsequently revised and published in 1982 as Islamic Revival in British India, Deoband 1860 to 1900. Barbara challenged the assumptions that shaped a generation of historical writing on modern India. By basing her work solidly on the Urdu writings of what had been taken to be traditional religious leaders, Barbara developed a historical perspective on India's colonial past that resonated well beyond the story of the Ulama. Perhaps most importantly, Barbara's work opened the worlds of those Ulama to historical analysis in ways that few works on reformers under colonial India had done. Previously viewed as traditionists or even as fundamentalists, these scholars were portrayed by Barbara as inhabiting a much more complex intellectual and institutional world. Characteristically, Barbara took us inside the worldview of these religious scholars, avoiding easy categorization in favor of an analysis that allowed us to hear their own voices and to understand what was of importance to these religious scholars themselves. And from the dissemination of fatwas, or religious rulings, to their interpretations of dreams, she emphasized first and foremost how they made sense of their world and their work, showing us the compelling framework of knowledge within which they operated, even as they sought to come to terms with change. The importance of Barbara's work lay in breaking out of the dichotomous distinction between tradition and modernity that continued at that time to dominate much of the scholarship on religious reform in both India and in the Islamic world. Rather than simply showing us, as some scholars had before, that religious reform movements might combine elements of the quote-unquote traditional and the quote-unquote modern, as Lloyd and Susan Rudolph did in their classic book, The Modernity of Tradition, Barbara showed us a way to escape the tyranny of these categories by taking seriously the language and the worldview of the reformers themselves. Barbara was involved in a major translation project that occupied much of her time in the 1980s. This was a translation of an Urdu text called Behishti Zewar, roughly translated as Heavenly Ornaments, a large compendium of information and advice for women written by one of the leading reformist scholars of Deoband, published just after the turn of the 20th century. As one of the most widely disseminated books in 20th century Muslim India, a work regularly given to newly married Muslim brides, this book was a natural for translation. The book illustrated the ways that reformed religious ideas, the subject of Barbara's earlier work, were transmitted to the common literate population. But in light of Barbara's larger interest in the comparative study of Islam, this project took on a far broader significance. Few issues are more central to the contemporary stereotypes of Islam than the treatment of women. In her introduction and the annotations of the Behishti Zewar, Barbara highlighted the distinctive vision of women's roles that shaped the thought of the reformist ulama, a vision influenced by the social pressures of society in India and yet rooted in exemplary models from the time of the Prophet. As always, Barbara tried to break the ideas in the Behishti Zewar free from prevalent dichotomies. Though far different from contemporary European visions of women's appropriate place, the ideas in the book also shared little in common with those of later Islamists or Muslim nationalists. Barbara saw instead ideas with far older roots. Though the Behishti Zewar differentiated clearly the appropriate roles of men and women and stressed women's domestication, It also posited fundamental differences in the innate capacities of men and women, for both of whom the Prophet himself represented the ultimate moral and behavioral model. Barbara's translation has now become one of the primary texts used in undergraduate teaching on Muslim women in 19th century India, and one of the most compelling challenges to easy stereotypes about the relationship between Islam and women. Barbara has since worked on several different projects. Perhaps most noteworthy has been her ongoing research on the Tablighi Jamaat, a transnational movement of religious reform originating in the Indian subcontinent that has stressed periodic travel and proselytization in the name of the faith. Travel, quote unquote, as Barbara has written in one article on the Tablighi Jamaat, is believed to encourage a state of permanent vulnerability and uncertainty in which one learns to be dependent on God outside of one's normal moorings. While others who have worked on the Tablighi Jamaat have stressed its transnational political implications, Barbara's work on the Jamaat has been far more original, stressing the ways that members of the Jamaat have dealt creatively with the tensions of gender, race, class, and nationality, playing these off against an idealized vision of sanctity associated with the model of the Prophet. The metaphor of movement, of becoming, remains central to the ways these identities have been negotiated, and in emphasizing this, Barbara has shown in a series of articles how members of the Tablighi Jamaat are engaged in the same struggles to come to terms with the contradictions of modern identity that face many other groups in an era of mass migration and travel. How Barbara's work has reflected, at the same time, an ongoing awareness of the inescapable pressures on the historian of contemporary political realities. The reality of the increasingly beleaguered position of Muslims in India in the wake of the post-Ayodhya riots of 1992 provided a backdrop for her commentary on the responsibilities of scholars who write on Muslims in the contemporary world. Barbara also published numerous articles that engaged directly with the problems facing Muslims in contemporary India. In this work, as earlier, Barbara's main concern is to show us that Islamic ideas do matter and must be evaluated in their own terms. Yet at the same time, they must be analyzed within their own distinctive, complex contexts and outside the stereotypes that continue to shape a large body of writing on Islam. These issues become all the more important in the wake of the events of 9/11. Given Barbara's sympathetic treatment of the earlier history of Deoband, and given the historical connections between Deoband and the emergence of the Taliban in Afghanistan in the 1990s, Barbara's work has taken on a new significance, as reflected in the reissue of a Deoband book. Barbara has been extremely active in speaking publicly about the importance of South Asia's Islamic history in framing recent events. She has made clear that sweeping generalizations about the Ulama and about the historical influence of Deoband itself are highly problematic. Deobandi influence has expressed itself in markedly different ways in different political and social contexts, in India, in Pakistan, in Afghanistan, and in the broader Muslim world as a whole, as recent events have shown. The complexity of the Deobandi legacy is evident in her recent biography of Maulana Hussain Ahmad Madani, one of the leaders of the Deobandi tradition who fought for the economic betterment of Muslims and who opposed the creation of Pakistan as a separate Muslim state in 1947. But as Madani's life also makes clear, the lives of the ulama in the early 20th century have considerable relevance for understanding contemporary politics. Madani was radicalized during his long imprisonment on the island of Malta in the name of British colonial security, an episode central to Barbara's analysis of his life. His story, as Barbara has forcefully pointed out, thus has considerable relevance for thinking about today's quote-unquote war on terror and the history of Guantanamo. This is a very brief introduction of Barbara, and I had never heard of this lady before. And if you read her book, Islamic Revival in British India, Deoband 1860 to 1900, you cannot stop admiring this lady for her objectivity, for her forthright thinking, for being able to take a stand. She went to Deoband, to Saharanpur, to Delhi. She learned the language. She lived among the Ulama, and she wrote something that most Muslims should have done. Rather, the contemporary Musliman is out to defame and to denigrate the sacrifices of these scholars.